All right, everyone. Thanks for coming out again to U.S. foreign policy. So what we're going to do here is the first part of this lecture is going to be a very conventional part, from a very U.S. point of view. How do we train the military? This is military and terrorism. But then it will veer into a more unconventional part, which I think is very important. And you're going to see a couple videos, other lectures, ones that I give in other classes as well, that I think are important for this course. The first thing is, how do we train the military? Well, that's a very good article by Hoffman, even though it was published a while ago, is this idea of these competing skills. And Bezovich, if I'm pronouncing that name, Andrew, Bezovich correctly, who's from, I believe, Boston University, kind of challenged this Petraeus doctrine, where it was just two stark, contrasting ways. And what Bezovich is adding is he's basically talking about counterinsurgency, traditionalists, utility outfielders, and the division of labor, kind of like, the old Smithian the division of labor. So you basically have these ideas of I'll start with one of them, the traditionalists. This is a way to train our military for traditional adversaries. This is kind of harking back towards World War II, after, as I talked about, the National Security Act. And, we had to deal with Russia from a U.S. perspective, of course, because this is U.S. foreign policy. So Russia was our adversary. So it's more of a state-centric view of the world. That basically is very important, because if you take a traditionalist approach, then you say to yourself, hey, excuse me, I got some Russian vodka Putin actually sent to me. We're good friends. But anyways, so that's it. Putin is our enemy. So Russia is our enemy. It's the traditional enemy, like the Soviet Union. It's a more state-on-state way to see the world. And that means a lot for like resources. Instead of dealing, say, funneling resources into counterinsurgency, like, say, for example, when we went to Vietnam, which I'm going to talk about, or what's behind me, this is actually Nicaragua, a man named Sandino, when the United States was trying to root him out in the 1920s. That, we're not dealing with people like that, guerrilla warfare. We're dealing state on state. And that's why that article on Mattis changing the national security doctrine from counterinsurgency to more state actors is so important, because we go through these different doctrines. Like we talked about before, what are doctrines? Well, the Bush doctrine dealt with, because of 9/11, non-state actors. But then with the rise of China, the rise of Iran, right? And I attribute the rise of Iran to the Iraq War, where Iran was the biggest winner of the Iraq War because it took out a balancer, Saddam Hussein, and Iran expanded significantly throughout the region, now even in Yemen. So these state actors are the threat. It's interesting, the counterinsurgencies are like the more post 9/11 that were like, no, these Al-Qaeda. We need to understand how counterinsurgency works. Counter, remember, means countering the insurgency. So the goal is to essentially stop these insurgents, whoever they are, non-state actors. It could be in Vietnam, it could be in Colombia. We're going to do something on the peace process, all that stuff like that, with the FARC trying to overthrow the government in Colombia, which you're going to see some other smaller videos that you might have seen if you've taken me for other class, but they're very important to understand the idea of counterinsurgency, because counterinsurgency is a very difficult thing to deal with. If you took my national security class, you'll know that there are some key points, and I'll just highlight a couple. Is the idea it's asymmetrical, so it's invisibility. You never know who your opponent is, right? So during, say, the Vietnam War, you didn't know who the Viet Cong was, right? Because they're part of society. I lived in Nicaragua 8 years of my life, and they had a revolution. It was very interesting, because a lot of these former revolutionary insurgents were my students, and they used to tell me, they would be in school. They were much older, trying to learn English now. But when they were guerrilleros, those are guerrilla fighters trying to overthrow the Somoza government, they were essentially like, okay, I'm a student during the day, and then boom, I become an insurgent at night. You never know who they are. And then the government starts going a little crazy, right? Whatever government you're dealing with, and starts killing a lot of people, and that pushes more people into the insurgency to defend themselves. So this is very, very important to understand for quote unquote terrorism. What is a terrorist? And that's what we're going to get into after. I mean, a terrorist is an intersubjective understanding. So you basically have the idea that we should be trained for these things, right? And you also have another characteristic. In addition to invisibility, you have what we call deniability. You don't know who it is, invisibility, like what's going on, et cetera, but deniability, where people can deny it. And that's what you're going to see in the little video on the Andean Mall in Bogota, and also the No-Go nightclub. So it's like, who is doing this? That's what the United States, a lot of these people are saying we should be trained in. And this takes a different type of resource. You know, you need language skills, cultural skills. After I got back from Nicaragua, I was solicited by the CIA to be a political analyst because they liked the idea that I lived in a country for, what, 8 years? That's a long time. The reason being, of course, I had to leave the country for legal reasons. That's not true. I'm only kidding. But excuse me, I think I have that COVID thing. So you have that, what's going on here. So you basically have the idea that, okay, we need these people who know on the ground, understand the insurgents. There's a lot of not just political analysts that know language skills, cultural skills, etc. But and this was important. If you took my national security class, they knew Cuba was involved in African revolutions because baseball fields started popping up all over Africa. That's one of the ideas of cultural skills. You use that to your advantage. So it's very interesting. And that's very important, because then they say, well, Cuba's getting involved. Cuba actually did very well in Africa, ironically, particularly in Angola. And you're going to see something on that. That's an amazing short documentary. So it's very, very interesting. All of these ideas that how do you train the military? Now, the more traditionalists like, no, China, we have to. So that means huge military might, right? A one-on-one war with China means developing a certain kind of weaponry by Lockheed Martin, Boeing, etc. So which one do you do? Well, there's also this idea of division of labor in the military, where a group will be trained, say, in counterinsurgency, language skills, etc. Another group may be in dealing with high tech, one-on-one, state-centric warfare, and then another and another. And then there's what they call utility infielders, which basically is to balance all of them. So you kind of get everyone is kind of getting trained in these areas. And all the soldiers I've had, and many in this class have, commented on how they are being trained at the beginning in all areas. And then they kind of go later. If they stay in the military, they move up, then they become more specialized, like the division of labor would prefer that kind of theory on how we do the military. But it's a very important article, because it's basically saying there's 4 ways to train. There's counterinsurgency, there's traditionalists, then there's these utility infielders, and then this division of labor. I don't know if I said outfielders or whatever, but you get the point, that this idea that how we train these soldiers. And the traditionalists have kind of taken over, I think, too, in a way, because of the rise of China, particularly now with the war in Ukraine. We're seeing, wow, the Ukrainians really have to prepare for a more traditional war. However, if Russia is able to take over these swaths of land, then you'll have an insurgency on your hand, and then you have to deal with, insurgencies. And that's one of the things that's interesting about traditional warfare. If you win, right, and you're able to take over a piece of land, then you have to deal with, insurgencies anyways. So I think you need both types of training. One of the things the United States has done, and we're kind of merging into the unconventional part, is to set up basically brutal dictators and puppets. That's exactly a common hegemonic power thing. So if you look at Russia, they have Belarusian dictator Lukashenko, who basically serves the Russian interest. One of the things I have, and I do not want you to agree with me, you're open to a degree, when we do military and terrorism, before we get into the psychology, which is the next week, and that's very important in propaganda, is that the United States, like all powers, has the tendency to downplay the human rights abuses of their allies and overplay the behavior and human rights abuses of their adversaries. So if you look at what Putin is doing, the United States and other countries has called in for war crimes. It's interesting. I think it was the foreign minister. She said, and it's not that guy, it was a woman. She said, oh, that would be great. We'll start with the Ukraine and then go into Iraq, Serbia, Kosovo, etc. All these bombings the United States has done. And even though I'm totally against this war in the Ukraine, there's truth to the matter. I mean, when we went in with a conventional war into the former Yugoslavia under the Clinton administration, we bombed by accident the Chinese embassy. Could you imagine if Russia bombed by accident in the Ukraine, the German embassy? Obviously would be saying, oh, we need to, investigate this, etc. States have this ability, attribution theory, which we'll get into in the next part of the next module, to, kind of overplay the adversary's behavior and underplay our own. So in like the United States, you'll be reading an article on Posada Carriles. Posada Carriles is a Cuban terrorist who helped blow up a plane of the Cuban fencing team. And the United States knew about it. It came out. This isn't some lefty blog like, the Huffington Post. It came out in the CIA that him and Orlando Bosch were involved in this. And, these were innocent fencing people, just the Olympic team. And they died. I believe they were leaving from Barbados. And we have had good relations with him. You'll see Teodoro Obiang from Equatorial Guinea, a brutal dictator that actually has very good relationships with the United States because it's an oil African country that produces oil. It's actually the only Spanish-speaking African country. The thing is that we, as the United States, do a lot of brutality. That's why you're going to watch the Noam Chomsky video. And you don't have to agree with everything they say. Like, obviously, we went into Iraq. Someone could say, at least we did try to create a semblance of democracy. But the United States supported Somoza of Nicaragua, who was a brutal dictator, Stroessner of Paraguay, Rios Montt of Guatemala, that was a genocidal maniac against the indigenous people, etc. So, when we get into military and terrorism, there is an intersubjective understanding of what terrorism is. Think about it. If just suspending reality, we were back in the UK when the UK was trying to stop the revolutionaries in the United States. We won. Woohoo! From kicking them out, they would have called Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, etc., a bunch of terrorists, bandits, etc. So it's always kind of done within this kind of purview of the imperial power. Here behind me is a man named Augusto Sandino. I took this photo when I was a professor at La Universidad Centroamericana, La UCA. That was a university in Nicaragua, where I lived, and they had a revolution, and it was named after him, who fought against United States soldiers in the 1920s, and then was later killed in the early 30s by the Somoza dynasty that we supported for years. As FDR once said, he might be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch, meaning Somoza was a horrible person, but he was our ally. And that gets us into, after Sandino, the Sandinistas took over in 1979, they renamed the airport Augusto Sandino and rebranded him a hero. So the point here is that when the United States or any other country goes into these countries for wars, like, Vietnam, is the Viet Cong, according to the population, as bad as what we say? Remember, we lost the Vietnam War. And one of the things is, we used to call them, Lyndon B. Johnson would call them pajama people. Right now, I am not calling them pajama people. Someone called me racist once and they said Japanese, but it wasn't Japanese. It was the Vietnamese. And I'm citing Lyndon B. Johnson, underestimating your opponents. This is important for this lecture, military and terrorism, because this is a big thing. Now, is Putin underestimating the Ukrainian resolve? My argument in this case, which is very, very important for military and terrorism, is that Putin was in charge of the Chechen wars. And there wasn't one, there wasn't two, there's like 3 or 4, and it was brutal. And we turned our the other way, hoping, well, nothing will happen after. And that was a big mistake, I think. And not only did he have to deal with the Chechens, but when they came back, the widows, called the Black Widows, of these soldiers came back instead of creating terrorist attacks. For them, they weren't terrorism. I think Putin understood that he was in the long haul for this, even though he might have underestimated some key things. But that's for you to decide as well. And what should the United States, from a military perspective, should do? Should the United States be beefing up NATO more? Should we go after Russia in a more aggressive manner? What should we do? And that's one of the things. Now I'm looking here at one of the issues here at, our new national defense doctrines. This is, as you'll be reading, let me take the next national defense strategy, and I'm going to keep it on there for a lot of classes, because it's interesting how, in my opinion, it seems to be stating more state actors than non-state actors. So, it sees Russia, but it really stresses China. So from a very U.S. perspective, because this isn't national security, this is, U.S. foreign policy, from a U.S. perspective, is China the biggest threat? And I want everyone to understand, when I start, arguing things, because the thing about political science, it's not, people like, is it a real science? It's interwoven with our opinions. It's okay to disagree with me. In fact, when you read that article on Posada Carriles, we supported terrorism. I had a guy from Florida in my class who would email me and saying, you don't understand, Luis Posada Carriles is a hero. He was obviously Cuban American. So, and I welcomed it. I didn't mind it. So it's okay to disagree with me and other students, etc. I know, being a student, sometimes you're a little nervous too, but he was really adamant. But the reason I bring it up is I really think he was, his interaction with me demonstrated the fact that the idea of military incursions, the idea of terrorism, is very subjective. What is a terrorist? For me, Luis Posada Carriles is a terrorist, right? If I was in Miami right now, I'd probably get killed because they love him. So the idea is, what a terrorist is intersubjective, and you have to understand that, because when you go into a country like Russia, the Soviet Union, and Afghanistan, they went in over their heads, us in Vietnam, Che Guevara in Bolivia, so this isn't an ideological argument. The US is bad, Russia's bad, someone's bad, etc. This is like when Che Guevara, the revolutionary from Argentina that participated in the Cuban Revolution, etc., that became kind of a folk hero in revolutionary movements, went to Bolivia with his FOCO theory. FOCO theory, one of the things that's important, and one, stressed the role of the peasantry, which Marx did not like. But 2, it said we can create the conditions of revolution, meaning you don't need a lot of poverty. You can just create the conditions for a revolution. And he was dead wrong. So he went into Bolivia, that is Che Guevara. He went into Bolivia and he said, we're going to have a revolution. But what he didn't know was the Eisenhower administration actually supported when we get into diplomacy, this is going to be important, actually supported a revolutionary government, and created what they call land reform to the peasants, gave Bolivian indigenous people certain rights that decreased the need for a revolution. So Che Guevara was basically killed there because the conditions didn't exist for a revolution. But in his head, he was like, I can create the conditions, etc. You got to watch out when you get into military involvement. And this happened in the Iraq War with Ahmad Chalabi. Ahmad Chalabi, which might pop up on an exam somewhere, was very important because he was advising the Bush administration, saying, and he was Iraqi, but he was like an Iraqi snake. No one loved him when he ran for president. He basically only got like 2% of the vote. But he was saying, you're going to go in as heroes into the Iraq war. We did not go in as heroes. Most people saw us as invaders. It didn't work well. And the same thing goes for Afghanistan. The idea that, we kicked out the Taliban, they took over with lightning speed. And, we can get into, when you read that article after Afghanistan, if I'm still using it, I like to change the articles around. The idea is it was a horrible, horrible takeover. Now, it's obviously the Taliban are not good people, but that was one of their goals, was to take over. And just like Mao Zedong said, Chiang Kai-shek, who he defeated, is the best arms supplier, and Peru's Shining Path said the same thing. Abamel Guzman, that you basically want to hijack and sequestrar. How do you say sequestrar? Kidnap people who you can use. So you want this big military equipment by the stronger power, and then take it and use it on your own. And that's what the Taliban did. They had a concerted strategy to take over Afghanistan quite rapidly, so then they could use that equipment. And the same thing goes in the Cuban Revolution in 1959. Castro actually used parts of Batista's vertical security system. And people say the Sandinistas use some parts of Somoza, etc. So, you become kind of a dictator. That's what's going on in Nicaragua now, is that, Daniel Ortega, who helped overthrow a dictator, now has become a dictator. So this is one of the biggest problems of revolutions. But the thing here that we have to understand is, military and terrorism is a very difficult thing. And I'll end with this, because there's a lot to think about, is that what we need basically is to use the military more judiciously. We throw it around too much. Iraq, Afghanistan, Haiti, Nicaragua, El Salvador, to stop the FMLN, which was going to take over in El Salvador in the 1980s. We forget Grenada we invaded, right? We invade the Dominican Republic. Cuba, we took over, I mentioned, with the Platt Amendment. That created conditions for Castro later to be quite popular and overthrow Batista. The goal here is not to understand all the historical parts I'm saying, but do states, when they get involved into military incursions, are they doing the right thing? If you think about it, we didn't need most of our wars, right? Obviously, World War II, the Revolutionary War, there were wars we needed. But we supported, for example, when we invaded Panama, we supported Noriega before. And then we went in to a very poor barrio, killed a lot of people. And then, although the United States denies it, and then to get them out. But why did we support them in the first place? People will say, oh, we had to support them. No, we didn't have to support them. Right? There are choices and policies. So that's what I think I want you to take away from this is, one, terrorism is very intersubjective. You have to understand your enemy. Two, a lot of these military incursions from, Russia and Afghanistan, Russia now in the Ukraine, the United States, and from Nicaragua, Haiti, Iraq, Afghanistan, know what you're doing before you go in. I don't think we do. In fact, there's evidence that we were actually reading when we went into Iraq, a book on tourism, because we had no real Iraqi experts. That gets into the training of the military. And essentially, does the United States and other countries do a lot of the same things? Although I did support the incursions in Yugoslavia, sorry to my Serbian students, many hate when I say that, which is fine. Again, I like when you disagree with me, because I do think that there was genocide going on. But, we did bomb a lot of things, in the former Yugoslavia in 1992 to stop Slobodan Milosevic, and then later in Kosovo, etc. Make sure you know what you're doing before an invasion. So, that's a lot to deal with. I hope you're enjoying the class, and reach out to me if you have any questions or comments. I will send out a list of what main points will be on the quiz. So you're not going through, your notes and the lectures and stuff like that, sort of things. But look at the lush background here. Nicaragua is very lush, very green, as Pablo Neruda said, hot as torture. So take care, everyone. And I hope you are having a great, I'm filming this in the summer, a great summer.